Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another edition of our Impact Investing in Agriculture podcast. For today's event, we have Marcelo Bacci. Marcelo is the Chief Financial Officer for Suzano. Suzano is a Brazilian company, which is the world's largest pulp producer. I'm sure Marcelo will tell us a little bit more about the impact on its own, about the footprint of Suzano. In addition to his role at Suzano, Marcelo is also a board member of BRF. BRF, another Brazilian company, is one of the world's largest food producers, a world's leading company in pork and poultry, one of the biggest exporters in the country. So thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you very much for being here today to join us with today's podcast.
Cristiano, thank you very much. It's a big pleasure to be here with you and trying to share some thoughts with the group, with the whole group here.
Thank you, Marcelo. Okay, and to start our conversation here, one of the most innovative and effective transactions among impact investing, debt financing alternatives was led by you. Was a transaction that was featured in most of the main newspapers around the world, by the Wall Street Journal, by the Financial Times, getting into details of the mechanisms. But I think it would be great if our listeners could listen straight from you exactly how it was structured and how you came with that idea to start with. Thank you, Marcelo.
Let me give you some, to start with some historical perspective. We've been at Suzano involved with the theme of sustainable finance for a while now, at least for the last 5 or 6 years. About 5 years ago, we launched our first green bond, which is a kind of a different structure in which we link the use of proceeds to certain projects of green nature. But back then, and this continued to be the case for a while, transactions of that nature would not bring any financial advantage to the issuer. In a sense that we would establish an additional commitment to a regular transaction, but with no particular gain in exchange in terms of reducing interest rates or having access to a broader range of investors. So it was not a very effective, I would say, structure. And we've been struggling since then to find better structures that could bridge the gap between the increasing amount of money that is looking for impact investing, especially ESG, and the possibility of companies like Suzano to provide a structure that would meet the needs of those investors. About 2 years ago, Enel in Italy, the energy company, launched the first sustainability-linked bond, which was a different structure in which the company, the issuer, would establish a certain set of ESG-related goals, and the interest rate of the transaction would be linked to the performance of the company in meeting those targets. That was a very interesting structure that worked out very well for Enel. It was kind of complex to establish, but for the first time in history, I think it met the objective of reducing the financing cost for the company in the same at the same moment that would be providing an advantage to the society or to the community. So we looked at that structure with a lot of interest, and we tried to give it a framework to it, in a sense that we would establish something that could be replicable for by us and by other companies in the future. So inspired by Enel, we put together this, and with the help of the group of banks led by JP Morgan, we put together a framework that enabled us to come up with the second transaction right after Enel, and more than that, to come up with a framework that could be used by other companies in the future. And since then, many other companies came with similar structures. Basically, what we do is to establish one or two or three, depending on the company. The first transaction, we had one goal. In the transactions that followed, we had two goals, ESG related, that have to be relevant to the business, have to be easy to measure, and also easy to compare, in a sense that the investors could get a very good sense of how relevant and how relevant the measure is for the business, and how well the company is performing related to it. And depending on the performance you have on that target, you establish a potential penalty for the interest rate. So in the case of the last transaction we did, for instance, we did already five. The last one was a 7-year bond in which we established two targets. One is increase the number of women in our leadership positions to 30% of the leadership positions in 5 years. And the second was to reduce the usage of water in our industrial operations by something but like 10% in also 5 years. So those are relevant to the business. Water consumption, for instance, is very important. It's a driver of cost in our industry, and also important for the environment. And women in leadership is a trend in terms of inclusion and diversity. And we find in a company, industrial companies like Suzano normally have lower participation of women in our leadership. It's something that has to be fixed over time. So we established those two targets that are very easy to manage, very easy to measure, possible to be measured and certified by a third party, which is also important. And we said to the investors that, look, it's a 7-year bond. In 5 years, we're going to measure how we're performing. If we don't meet those targets, interest rate would go up by 25 basis points for the last 2 years of the bond. If we meet the targets, interest rate will continue to be the same. By doing that, we attracted a lot of interest by ESG funds that increased the demand for the transaction in the first place, and enabled us to go to the market with a lower interest rate that would be the case otherwise, just because there's more demand than supply. We had 7 times oversubscription in that transaction, for instance.
That's very impressive, 7 times oversubscribed, Marcelo. Yeah. Let me just interrupt you for a second. How much cheaper would you say this debt was in comparison to a conventional bond?
Yeah, that's at the end of the day, that's the most important point in terms of evaluating how effective the transaction is for the company. Because of course you incur in a certain risk as an issuer of both a financial penalty by increasing the interest rate, but also a reputational risk, because you put together a structure and you go to the public to say that you're committed to a certain set of goals. So you have in our view, it's important to have a lower cost of capital in the first place to justify the risk and the additional cost. In the case of the transactions we did in the market in terms of bonds, the transactions came with between 10 and 20 basis points lower interest rates than a regular transaction would come. In our case, as we are a frequent issuer, it's easy to measure that because you compare with similar transactions that we did recently. The market has developed the concept of the greenium, which is what this difference is called, is the green premium. And what we see in the market is that between 10 and 20 basis points is the norm. Now, as the interest rates have been lower recently, the greenium is lower. When you have an environment of higher interest rate, the greenium is higher. But just to give you an idea, for a $500 million bond, if we get a 10 basis point greenium, it means that we are saving every year $500,000, which is a lot of money. 7 years is $3.5 million. If the greenium is 20 basis points, it's twice as much as that. So it's relevant. It pays for the additional cost that we have in the structure, and it pays for the risk of of not meeting the target. So that's been, more or less the average, between 10 and 20 basis points lower than a regular transaction.
The first bond you issued with those requirements, I think it was associated with how much carbon you captured. Could you
with carbon emissions in
carbon
that case?
emissions?
Carbon emissions by the industrial operations, the GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. In that case, we committed to reduce by 12% the emissions. Actually, Suzano is one of the few companies in the world that has a negative carbon footprint because of the forests that we plant. So we capture more carbon from the atmosphere than the emissions that we make on the industrial operations. But it's much harder to measure the capturing than the emissions. So instead of committing to sequestrate more carbon, which would make a lot more sense for us in terms of magnitude, we decided to go for the emissions, which is easier to measure and easier to understand from the point of view of the investor.
Understood. Tell us a little bit more about Suzano, about its operations, about its growth plan.
Sure. Suzano is a traditional company in the sector. It will be 100 years old in 3 years, so we're 97 years old. Started as a company trading paper back in the beginning of the century, founded by immigrants coming from Ukraine. And it developed over time into an industrial operation. And it has some landmarks in its history, which are very interesting. Suzano, up to the 50s, pretty much all the pulp produced in the world came from pine, which is a certain kind of tree. And Suzano developed, with the help of some academics, the introduction of eucalyptus as a raw material for pulp production. And that was an incredible breakthrough in terms of technology, in terms of biotechnology for the industry, because the cycle of the eucalyptus is way shorter than the pine cycle. Pine, for instance, if you go to the northern hemisphere, into Europe, for instance, there are pine plantations that have cycles of 30 to 50 years. So you harvest every 30 years. In eucalyptus, you harvest every 6 to 7 years. So the yields increased significantly with the introduction of eucalyptus. And that gave a huge cost advantage to us and to other companies that also adopted eucalyptus. So innovation is very keen to Suzano, and that was the best example. The company kept growing after that. And second, I would emphasize a second landmark moment or transaction, which was the merger that we did 2 years ago with Fibria, which was larger than Suzano. It was a very interesting transaction in which we put together the two largest companies in Brazil, creating the largest company in the world for pulp, in a transaction that involved payment for shares of close to $10 billion. So it was a very large transaction that created what Suzano is today. Suzano is, you said Suzano is the largest in the world. It is true, but more important than that, because to be big is not necessarily good, but more important than that, I would say Suzano is the lowest cost producer in the world of pulp. And our competitive advantage lies on the forestry operations. The industrial operations are very capital intensive, but it's easy to replicate. The equipment producers in the world are 2 or 3 European companies that can sell to everybody or to anybody in the world. What really makes the difference is the forestry operation. That's why we consider Suzano to be an agricultural company at the end of the day. We plant and harvest trees in short cycles with low cost and high scale in an efficiency that is the best in the world. And that's what we are very proud about. The future of Suzano is a lot linked to how well positioned we are in terms of the trends of environmental, social, and governance that we see in the world. The trees, as any agricultural operations, are a source of raw material that is renewable. So we plant, we harvest, and we plant again. And the products that get out of the tree, they are biodegradable and also recyclable. So that's a set of characteristics that meet many of the requirements that the world has in terms of materials for the future. So today, pulp is basically used to produce paper. So you have some grades of paper that have high growth in terms of demand in the world, like tissue papers or packaging, and some others are shrinking, like printing and writing paper. But in general, it's a market that grows 2 or 3% a year. But the big challenge for us is how we use pulp as a raw material to other applications that are not necessarily paper. There is, packaging applications substituting plastics, or other applications like paper straws, paper cups, clothing, and other things, fuel, many other things that are today byproducts or products coming from fossil fuel or fossil materials that could be substituted by something coming from the land, like the tree. So this is a big challenge and a big opportunity for us in the future.
Just a curiosity for the milestone number 1 you mentioned, when Suzano collaborated with some academics, one of those academics was actually my great uncle, Arlindo de Paula, who is the founder of the Forestry School in Viçosa. So he was the leading academic who was responsible for bringing eucalyptus from Australia and getting it adapted in Brazil. To give like our listeners an idea of the size of Suzano. I mean, when you talk about forestry, how many hectares of forestry Suzano currently cultivates?
Suzano now operates 2.5 million hectares, of which 2.4 million hectares to be more precise, of which 1.5 million are planted forests and 900,000 are reserves.
Understood.
We just process wood coming from the planted forest. That's a differential, not only for Suzano, but for all South American companies in general, different from some of our peers in Europe, for instance. We just operate with planted forests, and that gives us a very interesting perspective in terms of also the ESG trends. So we are the largest landowner in Brazil, probably one of the largest in the world. And that gives us a lot of responsibility in terms of how we deal with that, in terms of efficiency and also the environmental impact that we have.
Mm-hmm. And Marcel, the transaction, you guys were one of the pioneers. How much potential do you see for smaller companies to benefit from that sort of debt structure? Or do you think this is something which will really be reserved, let's say, and mainly adopted or used by larger companies?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Of course, the bond market is a market that is only accessible for a certain number of companies. The transactions are big. In order to justify the costs involved and the effort involved in issuing a global bond, you have to issue at least $300-400 million, which is something that is therefore applicable to large companies. But there is a number of other things that we can do with the same principle that could be way smaller and applicable to other types of companies. So we also did a structure some time ago of an export financing facility, also linked to ESG goals, in which the interest rate that in that case we pay to the banks also change in the same manner as the bond. It changes depending on how well we perform in relation to some targets. So that's a transaction that, in our case, it was a big transaction because we are a big company, but could be done in a smaller scale as well. And just today, to give you a very, interesting example, I got a message now from the CFO of Tembici. Tembici is the company that provides bikes the Itaú bikes that you see on the streets in São Paulo. And they did a transaction also linked to ESG targets with a group of banks, a transaction of 20 million reais, for instance, way smaller, to finance probably buying more bikes, to finance 500 bikes and 70 stations. And that transaction is linked to ESG targets as well. So that's an example that I got to know exactly today. Of something way smaller to a completely different kind of company. But in that case, provided the opportunity to do a transaction in the size that they needed. So I think the principle is very interesting. It could be used in many different forms.
Yeah. And Marcelo, when it comes to specific impact investing in agriculture, from your knowledge about the country, the different sectors, of course, also your experience at the board of directors of BRF, where do you see the main potential to impact agriculture in a positive way, or to impact the world through agriculture in a positive way?
Agriculture is at the heart of food security. So in the world, and there are specific regions where food security is something that still has to be achieved. Providing more efficiency to agricultural operations is something that is in that small group of things that is good for the companies that could enhance their productivities, and very good for the world, because land is a scarce asset. So we cannot grow agricultural land indefinitely in the future, and you have competition between agriculture, forestry, cattle raising, and other usages, cities and reserves, and many different things. And it's important that the operations become more and more efficient over time, doing more with less. So I think there is a big room here for impact investing, in the sense that the companies are seeking more efficiency, and that efficiency is oftentimes linked to using less resources. And the usage of less resources is also positive to the environment and to the impact in the society as a whole. And there is a number of investors with a significant amount of money seeking opportunities of impact investing. So I think agriculture is probably the best sector for that. I would say, together with energy production, which is also very interesting for that matter. But I see a lot of opportunity, and the experience that I have in the companies I'm involved with, and it is that, whenever you reduce the usage of a certain natural resource in your operations, you achieve two goals. Your production gets cheaper, and you reduce the impact you have on the environment. Being that water usage or emissions, or whatever, or residuals. Whenever you can reduce the production or reduce the usage of natural resources, you also get more competitive. Mm-hmm. So I think we have room for many different things. We need to get creative. We need to build on the experiences of other companies. But I see a significant amount of room in agriculture as a whole to seek solutions of that nature.
Until a couple of years ago, very little was spoken about ESG. Very little was spoken about. There was very little interest. We can argue why there was, but there was very little interest from investors to fund ESG companies. And then over the last 2 years, we've seen a major boom in capital allocation towards ESG investments. And more recently, some people started talking a little bit about the potential of a bubble being formed in specific ESG investments. Do you think there is a bubble? Do you see the risk? Do you see any risk for capital misallocation in the space? What would be your view?
There is a risk. I think that's a justifiable concern. And I see from 2 points of view. There is a growing amount of funds seeking impact investing, and you have today a mismatch between supply and demand. There's a lot of people looking for investments, and you don't have enough projects that are robust to receive those investments in a way that is, impactful and also profitable. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about businesses. We're not talking about philanthropy here. Whenever that happens, that kind of thing happens, you run the risk of seeing things being sold as impactful or as green or as ESG friendly that at the end of the day are not. And that's what the market is calling greenwashing. So I think the risk here is that businesses that are not necessarily the best alternatives for those kind of investing, trying to sell themselves as something as they're not. And that can create a problem for the credibility of the sector in the future. And it's up to all of us involved in the sector to identify and to raise concerns about things of that nature. But I think it's, on the other hand, I think it's part of the maturation process of this thing, because, it's a new thing, as you said. It has to be developed. The investors not necessarily know exactly what they're looking for. This will be matured over time. And in that process, some things will be made in a wrong way. And we have to look at that as part of a learning process as well.
It's interesting to say that. For example, nowadays, whenever you read a international newspaper or something like Financial or The Economist, every ad in those papers sponsored by a international bank, by wealth management, by a fund. It's all about ESG. It's all about how they are the best allocators of funds towards ESG investments. When you deal with fund managers, when you deal with banks, how mature do you see them in terms of fully understanding the intricacies of this space and really being able to judge what is an actual impactful investment or what isn't?
I think we are in a process of developing those concepts in a broader way. Let me also put you in a historical perspective. I've been CFO of Suzano for 7 years now. So in the last 7 years, I've been interacting with investors the whole time. 7 years ago, there was virtually zero meetings that I had with investors where they wanted to discuss ESG. They wanted to discuss other things. ESG was a very rare thing. And then it started to become a theme coming from European investors some time ago, and is now part of pretty much all the meetings that I have with investors. Some of them are checking boxes. Some of them have been told by their investors or by their bosses that they have to look into ESG aspects in every company. And they have a set of questions that they have to make, and they check the boxes and say, look, this company is not doing anything wrong. Some others, so they're looking for like compliance in that case. They're trying to avoid investing in companies that are doing something wrong. Some other ones are more sophisticated, and they look at companies that are doing ESG related initiatives as part of their business or as a competitive advantage and as other things. And that requires a lot more knowledge from the part of the investor to understand what the company is doing. So I think we are in that process. Many people are checking boxes and trying to make sure they're not doing anything wrong. And some other people are looking into more details, into more depth what the companies are doing. I think it's a process. Investors, in addition, and I think that's a very important point that I learned over time. Whenever investors are looking into ESG, they are looking into two things, and especially in debt financing, like you said in the beginning, like with the bonds. The debt investor is not looking for any upside. He wants to get paid back in the future exactly what the amount of money that they lent you. They don't have any big upside. They want to make sure that you're around and sound when the debt matures. So they started to see ESG as a risk factor. Is this company doing something that will put the company out of business over time by doing something wrong with the environment, for instance? Is this company, if the product that the company is doing runs the risk of being substituted by something else because it's harmful to the environment, and somebody's going to find out in the future that this product is not going to be allowed anymore? So there is an aspect of risk management that is also important for this, and I think this is very healthy for every one of us, because whenever people were assessing risk in the past, risks of that nature were not being looked at in a proper way, and today they are. So some people are looking at the risk, some other people are checking boxes, some other people are looking as a differentiation. But I think it's a process of maturation that we're living, and the investors in general are getting more sophisticated in their ability to understand this issue. And we still have a big confusion. We have today, for instance, in the market, a number of companies that are doing ratings of ESG in different companies. They're saying this company is rate A, rate B, rate C because they do this, they do that. The amount of it's many companies doing that, and the rating that you get in one has nothing to do with the other because they look at different aspects. So it's a maturation process that will lead these raters also over time to look at a similar set of KPIs to come up with a framework that is more generally used. So I'm particularly involved in that. I participate in 2 global forums, one which is sponsored by the UN, which is called the CFO Task Force, where we have a lot of CFOs from different companies in the world that are trying to establish some patterns to make the lives of the investors and the companies easier in terms of what really matters, how you report those things and things like that. And there's also another initiative by the UK that I'm also part of that are trying to do similar things. So it's a maturation process in which we have to contribute and help the market find the proper standards.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You're extremely knowledgeable about the situation, and of course, sustainability or trying to cause an impact via its own business is on Suzano's DNA. So I can only assume that as a board of directors, it was something natural for you to deal with the current, what became a most current issue. What we see is that some other companies haven't been that fast to adapt. Some other board of directors, or they haven't been that fast to adapt. And there has been recently a lot of shareholder activism asking those companies to change. Chevron was a recent example of that phenomena, but most certainly there are other companies which are in the same situation. What advice would you give to fellow board members in those other companies, how to prepare or how to deal with the situation, Marcelo?
I think that's a very important question, and I would say that I have to recognize that this issue is a lot easier to deal with for Suzano than for other companies, because for us it's a big upside. We don't have any risk associated to it other than reputational risk. But the more the society gets concerned about ESG, the best position we are. And that's not true for all the companies in the world, of course. I would say, as a board member, I would start by analyzing how ESG impacts that particular business. Is it an opportunity? Is there a risk? Is there the products that we make will be favored or will be challenged by the ESG trends? Is there something that we do that could be potentialized by these new trends? Because I think the trend that we see in the society will not revert. The society is now knowledgeable and understands that if we continue the way we are going to continue to see our planet getting warmer over time, and that will create more climate problems, and that will be harmful for everybody, including our businesses, especially agriculture. So that conscience is there. So I think the society and the countries and the regulation, everything will become more strict over time. So that's a trend that, in my view, will not revert. And so, having said that, how your company is positioned in relation to that? What are the things that you do that will be favored by that? What are the things that you do that will not be possible to be done in an environment like that? How can you change that? How can you adapt the company for that trend? I think that's the important question. In the case of Suzano, I think we found out, I think it rang a bell that we were at the right side of the equation. That was not very clear to us. And we started, for instance, in our case, to become much more vocal and participate more in the public discussions about that. Suzano used to be a very shy company in the past. We had never, up to this year, for instance, we had never in 97 years made any television announcement, for instance. It was the first time we did during the Olympics, talking about ESG. So, for us, that was the way. For other companies, that there will be something else to be done. But I think it's important that any board level, any entrepreneur, any business person to understand how this trend that will continue for a long time will impact positively or negatively your business.
Thank you. Good words. One last question. If you're an investor, at the end of the day, you have to make money. And if you're an investor looking for impact investing, and if you're an investor reading about the potential of a bubble, you start getting a little bit worried about your returns. Am I just paying too much for what it is? Where do you see value? Where do you see good opportunities? Where do you still see a good place for investors to look for opportunities where there is an impact, but they can also make the returns they need to?
I would look at it in two different angles. Let me simplify here by saying the fixed income investor angle and the equity investor angle. In the fixed income investor angle, you're looking for lower risk. So you're trying to look at the ESG aspects with the question that I raised some minutes ago. Is the ESG strategy of this company sound enough that will make sure that this company will be sound, making money, and able to pay me back whenever this transaction matures in the future? So they will, I think the risk reduction coming from a sound strategy from the environmental side has value for the fixed income investor by reducing the risk. If you look from the equity investor point of view, I think it's a bit more complex, of course. The question they will ask is the same for tech companies, for that matter. Is this how this trend will favor this company in the future, and how well positioned the company is to surf in this wave in the future in terms of new products, new revenues, new solutions? I think the value will be created by the opportunities, of course, for the equity investors. So, and this will be their focus. How this trend will impact the ability of this company to grow revenues and therefore grow results in the future that will justify paying more for this investment right now. And of course, they will not get this right every time. There will be mistakes, just like in the tech world. So this will be another very hot area for investments, where I'm sure some mistakes will be done, but a lot of value will be created. And that will be up to us, the companies, to create and to seek and go after these opportunities.
Very good, Marcelo. Has been a great pleasure talking to you. Very enjoyable, very thoughtful, very informative discussion. So I'd like to thank you for joining us in this episode of Impact Investing in Agriculture podcast. Thank you very much, Marcelo.
Has been a pleasure to me. Congratulations for the initiative, and you can count on me for any new talks whenever you want. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. Stay well. Thank you very much, everyone who
You
listened
too.
to us or watched to us on YouTube. Please hit that like button. Please subscribe. Please share, and let's keep this conversation going so we can create this community of people who are concerned about impact investing, more important, who are doing something about it. It's not just government, it's not just society itself that can help change the world. Companies, investors have a very important role to play. So let's work on that. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Marcelo. Bye-bye.